everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Sarah, and today we're going to be talking about the little rabbit hole I went down starting last year called the FLDS. Now, our library has several memoirs written by people who left the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Starting in October of 2023, I ended up reading 7 of these memoirs, and I want to share with you what I ended up learning. The group henceforth shall be called the FLDS, just because it's less of a mouthful to say. The FLDS is a fringe religious movement, which, according to definitions, some would call a cult. It is an off-branch of the regular Mormon church. They are made up of members who over the years either removed themselves or were kicked out because they wanted to continue the practice of polygamy. I want to clarify in this video that the mainline Mormon church, or the LDS church, is completely against the polygamous practices and illegal practices of the FLDS. Polygamy is no longer practiced in the Mormon church, at least in this life. From research I've done, some do believe there will be polygamy in the next life. If anything, from what I understand, a lot of members of the LDS church are actually embarrassed by the FLDS and wish it just did not exist. Now, I'll be going in order of publication, as the cult does change over time with different leaders and practices. The first book I want to go over is Escape by Jessop, which was published in 2007. She was born into the FLDS as the second daughter of his first wife on January 1st, 1968. She was illegally married as the fourth wife of Jessop when she was 18. He was 50 years old. Eventually, she ended up leaving in April 21st of 2003. This book, as far as I'm aware, is like the first published memoir on someone who left the FLDS. It was a big deal when she left because she was also one of, if not the first woman, to be able to leave with all of her children. Commonly, women who leave the FLDS are prevented from taking their children with her, but she ended up leaving with all of them. One of her daughters, Becky, ended up returning at 18, but she made sure all of her children had the opportunity to grow up in the outside world and to make that decision for themselves. In the book, she talks about being deeply unhappy while married to Jessop, who apparently favored Barbara Steed over all of his other wives and often would go along with whatever she said. And allegedly, Barbara abused this power and would use it to lord over the other wives in the family and take advantage. She would often boss around and humiliate the other wives, allegedly. It is also mentioned allegedly that Ruth, the full sister of Barbara Steed, had mental issues that perhaps could have been schizophrenia. It's not really clarified because these mental issues were left untreated, and oftentimes the family's reaction would either be, oh, that's just Ruth being Ruth again, or they would yell at her to get herself together, even though it was very clear that she had genuine mental health issues. Her husband would eventually marry off his of-age and underage daughters to Rulon and Warren Jeffs, who both served as supposed prophets of the group. I also think it's interesting to note that he owned the Hot Springs Hotel in Nevada for a year, which Carolyn helped run. This was the hotel that the girls were taken to often for the illegal marriages. Now, in 2010, Carolyn Jessop also published Triumph. Carolyn Jessop talks about what it was like leaving the FLDS, how her family had to adjust to life on the outside, as well as the raid in Texas. She went down there in person to meet her stepchildren, but she was forbidden to see them. She was also in court several times testifying to what kind of stuff was going on in the FLDS. These two books both hold a lot of information. It's a really powerful story reading about the first woman to be able to leave the FLDS with all of her children. I do think that it's a good read. I do recommend the first book over the second one, as I feel like the first one goes more into what life was like under the FLDS, and the second one a lot of times reiterates these same ideas, so it does go into more detail as to what her life was like after the FLDS. And yes, she does also in the second book go over the Texas raid, but as you will see, there are other books that go into this in more graphic and meaningful detail, in my opinion. The next memoir we're going to talk about was published in 2008. It was called Stolen Innocence: My Story of Growing Up in a Polygamous Sect, Becoming a Teenage Bride, and Breaking Free of Warren Jeffs by Alyssa Wall. Alyssa was born into the FLDS to the second wife in a polygamous marriage. Her father and his first wife were actually converts into the FLDS and had grown up in the mainline Mormon church. She had an illegal marriage to Alan Steed at the age of 14 when he was 19. She was very against this marriage and was essentially forced into it and was told if she did not agree to the marriage, that at the age of 14 she would be forced out into the street. The reason her memoir is of such importance is because she is one of the first people to go against Warren Jeffs in court. She was able to take Warren Jeffs to court for assault by accomplice, and initially she did win. It was eventually overturned, though, through a jury error, as the jury was not formally informed that Warren Jeffs was supposed to only be convicted if he specifically intended for Alan to assault Alyssa. This did not stop Alyssa. She was willing to go to court again, but thankfully other victims were able to come forward and it was not necessary. This book goes into detail, again, what it's like growing up in the FLDS. Unlike a lot of people on this list, she ended up marrying a younger man, but that did not necessarily make her life happier. Out of all the women on this list, she was probably also the most unwilling to end up with her future supposed husband. And it just shows the kind of dysfunction that goes on in this kind of a religion, even when you're married to a younger man, and when you're the only wife of that man, as she's also one of the only women, if not the only, who was not in a polygamous relationship with her husband. Next up is Lost Boy by Brent W. Jeffs, which was published in 2009. This was the first FLDS memoir I ended up reading, and I think it has a uniquely important perspective as it is the only one on this list that was written by a man. He was born under the first wife in a polygamous marriage, and he was the nephew to Warren Jeffs, related by his father's side. He is one of, if not the first person to press charges against Warren Jeffs formally. He pressed charges against Warren Jeffs, claiming that he was brutally assaulted as a child. He also was able to get with some other boys in the group who had been kicked out and press charges against the FLDS and Warren Jeffs for basically kicking them out as children and not providing them with the proper education and support that they would need to survive in the real world. They ended up settling for a sum of money that they were able to give to the boys personally, as well as devote to helping other boys who were being kicked out of the group. The efforts also got what was known as the United Effort Plan removed from church control and given back to the state, as they were abusing it by deciding who could and couldn't live on the property based on whether they believed the boys were following the religion strictly enough. I recommend this one highly simply because so few memoirs about leaving highly controlling religious groups or cults are written by men. We often see them written by women, which is great, and I think a lot of times this is because women do suffer the most under these kinds of groups, so they have the most to gain by leaving it and telling their story. But a lot of times men who suffer under these groups don't write about their experiences. Brent Jeffs was able to show just how bad it is, even if you're a boy in this kind of a religion. Like, he himself says in his memoir that everybody loses. His father was miserable, his brothers and sisters were miserable, his mothers were miserable, everyone was miserable. He says a lot of his friends assume that the idea of being able to grow up in a religion that allowed you to have many wives was wonderful, but he says that a lot of times the father cannot provide for the family, and he doesn't have time to spend with his wives and children, who are always fighting for his affection. I just think that this is really important because, again, a lot of times these books are shown from the perspective of women, when I think it would be helpful for people to know that everybody suffers in these kinds of religions. The next book is The Witness Wore Red, the 19th Wife Who Brought Polygamous Cult Leaders to Justice by Rebecca Musser. Rebecca Musser is the full sister of Alyssa Wall and was born to the second wife as well. Rebecca was born several years before Alyssa, so her telling of events is slightly different. For example, Rebecca writes about how the first wife of their father was incredibly abusive, allegedly, while Alyssa says that she acknowledges that she was born after most of that really bad fighting happened, so she doesn't really have strong memories of that. Her sister was married to Rulon Jeffs. Eventually, she would also have an illegal marriage to Rulon Jeffs when she was very young, as his 19th wife. He was 89 years old. Eventually, she ended up leaving the FLDS with one of his many grandchildren. This one is probably my personal favorite. Rebecca is so reflective in this book about her experience and the healing she was able to get later. She talks about both her life in the FLDS and outside the FLDS in detail, while most of the books on here, for understandable reasons, mostly focus on their life in the FLDS. She also was present during the Texas raid and was able to help the police, so she offers a lot of insight on what that event was like, unlike a lot of these other memoirs. If I were to recommend any memoir on this list, that would be the one. The sixth memoir I want to mention is Breaking Free by Rachel Jeffs, who is the daughter of Warren Jeffs. Now, Warren Jeffs is the big figure in the FLDS who is eventually convicted for his crimes and sent to prison. Because of this and the state of the memoir, she's able to talk about what it was like growing up in the household of who was started as a son of the prophet and then actually became the prophet of the group. She had an illegal marriage to Richard Allred at 18 when he was in his 20s. She was his third wife. There is some heavy graphic content in this book. There is in all these books, but this one specifically has mentions of the following triggers. So if you plan to read that, please keep that in mind and know if you're ready to read that kind of content. She ended up staying the longest in the FLDS out of all these memoirs. So she offers really powerful insight as to what kind of stuff went down after her father was imprisoned. She also, I think, is able to really portray the kind of fear and isolation that you go through when you're in this kind of community. She was often separated from her husband and children as punishment because she would speak out against the horrible things her father had done to her to just one or two people in her family. Some of the insane rules she mentions that were in the call were Warren Jeffs banned the color red from the community, such as wearing the color red or having red things. He banned all television and toys. There were clothing restrictions where he preferred members to wear pastel clothes and banned prints on all clothing. And clothes had to be put on starting with the right side of the body, and they had to say prayers while they were doing it. Other rules that were in the cult that were mentioned in other books was the banning of college education and closing of public schools. Dogs being banned because a child was killed by a dog and all the dogs in the community were murdered. Members were to wash their right hand over their left hand as well as pray before using the toilet. The final memoir that I ended up reading and that was published last on this list was Give Me Back My Children, Trapped in a Cult by Sarah C. Allred. This woman was married to the same woman that Warren Jeffs' Rachel was married to, Richard Allred, but she was his first wife. She had a legal marriage to him at 18 on November 18th, 1998. She was the daughter of a convert, Evan Carlisle, and his second wife. She was actually one of the few people in this group who was kicked out of the FLDS. This was done in 2 phases, starting by her having to live apart as a former wife and then eventually just permanently being told she had to leave and physically not enter that side of the United States ever again. She had to stay on the east side of the United States. It's really interesting comparing this book to Rachel's book because they were married to the same man and they portray each other very differently. A theme you'll commonly see in these books is that polygamous wives and their children writing about their mothers will talk about how their family and their little subsection of the family was persecuted or treated horribly while the father favored other people in the family. Now, I have never been in this situation, so I have no right, I feel like, to judge whether this is true or not, and I'm going to take them at their word that everything they experienced was true. As I mentioned earlier, I feel like everyone in these situations is unhappy, and I feel like it's impossible for these men to make their wives feel happy. Not because of any fault in their wives. God did not intend for a man to just have multiple women and to share his love among them and try to make it equal. Anyway, this comes into interest in this particular book. Sarah talks about Rachel as if she was snooty, snobby, as if she acted like she was just a little bit better than everyone else, and that because she was the daughter of the prophet, she could always get her way. And she talks about Rachel as if she had just swooped into their life, stolen Richard from her, as opposed to the other wives, and like was manipulating him all the time. She eventually talks about how she kind of became friends with Rachel and they were able to move past it, but she still like resented her a lot. Meanwhile, Rachel didn't really write about Sarah specifically that much as being a roadblock, but she did talk about all the other wives, saying that they did not accept her, that because she was the daughter of the prophet, they were jealous of her, and that they treated her differently, like in a negative way. Almost as in like, well, you're the daughter of the prophet, so you think you're better than us, so we don't want anything to do with you. And she mentions feeling hurt a lot of the time and that she was just left out of the family. She also felt like she wasn't given a lot of priority by her husband because she claims that her husband was afraid to offend his other wives, so rather than express affection openly for her, he would have to sneak around, and she felt like that wasn't fair. I just find this really interesting how 2 women married to the same man have very different perspectives. I'm not going to claim that either of them are wrong. As I mentioned earlier, I don't think anyone in this kind of situation who's forced to be in a polygamous relationship and not wanting to share their husband, they're going to feel like a victim either way. And maybe both of them are right. Maybe they both did feel like victims and miserable to this system. We're never really going to know because we weren't there. I will say that for this specific memoir, it has the most spelling errors and grammar mistakes, and probably was one of the less reflective memoirs. But it did talk about, again, kind of like a Pulitzer Wall, what it was like to be married to a younger man in the FLDS who had somewhat of a lower ranking. Though, like Alyssa's, her husband ended up moving up in the group because he worked closely with Warren Jeffs. Unlike Alyssa, though, she was very enthusiastic about this marriage and really loved Richard in her own way. Eventually, after she's kicked out of the group, she gets a, did you know you have rights? Constitution says you do moment, and gets her children back. I'm not going to really rank these books because they're such personal stories, being vulnerable about growing up in an incredibly abusive and oppressive environment. And I don't really feel like it's fair to rank that. I do say, though, that of all these books, I highly recommend The Witness Wore Red and Breaking Free. These 2 both go into such reflective detail as to what it was like being in the cult, what it was like after they left, and the growth that they went through, and offer really valuable insight as to what it was like being the FLDS. That is not to say I do not recommend the other books on this list. I do. These books all were able to fit pieces of the story of what it was like growing up in the FLDS in their own way. But I feel like these 2 specifically, if I were to recommend it to someone who just wanted a memoir to read about the FLDS, and didn't want to spend their time reading all these books, these are the two I would most recommend. Recently, I've started reading about another branch of fundamental Mormonism, because of course my hyperfixations will never end. This one is about the Church of the Fullness of Christ. The book I just read was called Shattered Dreams. She talks about when the FLDS was actually first formed, because she was born in the 30s. I did not include it in this one because she, even though she had sisters who joined the FLDS and was in that area, she herself did not join. But in the future, I want to do another video about what it was like reading all those memoirs. Thank you again for watching. I hope that you got something out of this video. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. On this channel, we talk about books, about cults, and what it's like being a woman in these kinds of religious environments. Bye for now.